The Galactic Institute's grand hall stretched impossibly high, its crystal spires catching starlight from a dozen different systems. Dr. Samira Patel adjusted her collar, trying not to feel small beneath the towering architecture that seemed designed to remind visitors of their insignificance. As Earth's leading expert in theoretical mathematics and pattern recognition, she had earned her place here, even if the whispers and sidelong glances from alien scholars suggested otherwise. The Institute's selection committee had initially rejected her application 3 times, citing humanity's developmental status as a spacefaring species. It took unprecedented scores on their standardized tests and a recommendation from the respected Arcturian mathematician Dr. Kvex to finally secure her position. Now, 6 months into her fellowship, Samira still felt like an unwelcome curiosity. "Attention, gathered minds," announced Director Enexilith, their crystalline form refracting light in complex patterns. "We face an unprecedented situation. The archivists have recovered a complete puzzle sphere from the precursor ruins on Kepler 186f. The assembled scholars buzzed with excitement. Precursor artifacts were rare, and complete ones were almost mythical. Samira leaned forward, her heart racing. The precursors had vanished millions of years ago, leaving behind technologies and mathematical principles that still defied understanding. This particular artifact, Enexilith continued, appears to be a test of sorts. Our preliminary analysis suggests it contains a mathematical proof of unprecedented complexity. We believe solving it could unlock significant precursor knowledge." A holographic projection materialized in the center of the hall. The puzzle sphere floated there, its surface covered in shifting symbols that seemed to ripple and flow like liquid mercury. Samira's fingers itched to touch it, to begin mapping its patterns. "All qualified scholars are invited to attempt its solution," Enexilith said, their tone becoming formal. "However, given the artifact's importance, we must prioritize those with the highest probability of success." The meaning was clear. Humans would be last in line, if considered at all. The first to approach was Professor Ziwextal, a hive-mind mathematician from the Vega system. Their dozen components moved in perfect synchronization, neural networks processing the puzzle's patterns at incredible speeds. After 6 hours, they withdrew in frustration. Over the next several days, scholars from across the galaxy tried and failed. The quantum cognition specialists from Sirius Prime lasted the longest, spending 3 full days in communion with the sphere before admitting defeat. Each failure added to the puzzle's mystique. Samira spent her time observing, taking careful notes. She noticed something others seemed to miss: the symbols didn't just shift randomly. There were subtle rhythms, almost like music. They reminded her of the patterns she'd studied in Earth's natural systems, the spirals of galaxies, the growth patterns of shells, the branching of trees. On the 7th day, when no other scholars stepped forward, Samira raised her hand. The silence that followed was deafening. "Dr. Patel," Enexilith said, their tone careful. "You understand this puzzle has resisted the efforts of our most advanced minds. Your species' mathematical understanding is primitive by comparison." "With respect, Director," Samira replied, keeping her voice steady, "sometimes a fresh perspective can reveal what expertise overlooks. I would like to try." Murmurs rippled through the hall. A Centaurian scholar made a sound like breaking glass, their species' equivalent of derisive laughter. "Very well," Enexilith said finally. "You may approach the sphere. Try not to damage it." Samira walked forward, ignoring the skeptical looks. Up close, the sphere was even more beautiful. The symbols seemed to respond to her presence, their movements becoming more pronounced. She pulled out her tablet and began recording their patterns, looking for correlations. Hours passed. Samira worked methodically, mapping each symbol's movements and interactions. Many scholars left, convinced they were witnessing a futile exercise. Others stayed to watch what they assumed would be an amusing failure. But as the Institute's artificial day cycle began to dim, Samira started to see it. The patterns weren't just mathematical, they were organic. The precursors hadn't created a purely logical puzzle, they'd encoded something more fundamental about the nature of intelligence itself. She thought back to her doctoral thesis on biological computing systems, how living organisms processed information in ways that sometimes defied traditional mathematical models. The precursors puzzle wasn't asking for a solution, it was asking for understanding. "Director," Samira said, her voice cutting through the quiet hall. "I'd like to test a theory." Enexilith drifted closer, their crystalline form dimming slightly to indicate attention. "Proceed." Samira took a deep breath and reached out to touch the sphere's surface. The symbols responded immediately, swirling around her fingers like curious fish. She began to input a sequence, not of numbers or equations, but of simple growth patterns found in nature across the galaxy. The sphere hummed, its symbols moving faster. Scholars who had been about to leave stopped and turned back. Something was happening. "Impossible," someone whispered as new patterns began emerging on the sphere's surface. Patterns that matched exactly with the fundamental structures of organic life, from the simplest bacteria to the most complex neural networks. Samira's hands moved faster, adding more patterns, building on the sphere's responses. She was no longer thinking about the audience, about proving humanity's worth. She was lost in the pure joy of discovery, of communication with minds that had pondered these same universal truths millions of years ago. The sphere's surface erupted in a cascade of light, its symbols arranging themselves into a complex three-dimensional model of interconnected systems. It was beautiful, and more importantly, it was readable. "It's not just a puzzle," Samira breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's a key to understanding how the precursors viewed consciousness itself. They weren't testing our mathematical ability, they were testing our ability to recognize the patterns that connect all living things." The hall erupted in excited discussion. Scholars rushed forward to examine the sphere's new configuration, their previous skepticism forgotten in the face of discovery. Enexilith's crystalline form blazed with colors Samira had never seen them display before. "Dr. Patel," they said, their voice carrying a new note of respect. "It seems we have much to learn from Earth's perspective after all." Samira nodded, her heart full. As she stepped back to let others examine the sphere, she couldn't help but smile. Humanity might be young in galactic terms, but they had something valuable to contribute. Sometimes the simplest truths were the hardest to see, especially when you were convinced you already knew everything. News of Samira's breakthrough spread through the Galactic Institute like a quantum wave collapse. Within days, scholars from dozens of species crowded the Great Hall, all eager to witness the human who had decoded the first layer of the precursor sphere. But with recognition came complications. "Your initial success was unexpected," said Professor R.H. Tal, the Institute's head of advanced mathematics. The Proximan's feathered crest rippled with barely contained agitation. "However, the deeper layers of the sphere remain locked. Perhaps it's time to let more qualified minds take over the analysis." Samira stood her ground, though her heart raced. The sphere floated between them, its surface now showing entirely new patterns that had emerged after her breakthrough. "With respect, Professor, I believe these new symbols follow similar principles to the first layer. If you'll allow me to continue." "The Institute cannot risk damaging an artifact of this magnitude," R.H. Tal interrupted. "The Proximan Science Council has sent their finest quantum consciousness experts. They will take over the investigation." Before Samira could protest, a new voice joined the conversation. "According to Institute protocol, the right of discovery grants Dr. Patel primary research authority." Dr. Kvex emerged from the shadows, their ancient Arcturian form moving with deliberate grace. "Or has that policy changed since I last served on the board?" R.H. Tal's crest flattened, a sign of reluctant acquiescence. "The human may continue her research. Under supervision." As R.H. Tal swept away, Kvex turned their multifaceted eyes toward Samira. You've stirred up quite the storm, young one. Many here are struggling to accept that their assumptions about human cognitive capabilities might be wrong. Samira nodded, grateful for the support. The sphere is showing us something revolutionary about consciousness and mathematics. But every time I try to explain my methods, they dismiss them as primitive pattern recognition. Perhaps that is precisely why you can see what others cannot, Kvex mused. Tell me, what have you discovered about these new symbols? Samira activated her tablet, projecting her latest findings. The first layer revealed how the precursors understood the connection between organic patterns and consciousness. These new symbols seem to build on that foundation, but they're more complex. They don't just show patterns, they show how patterns evolve and interact. She manipulated the projection, highlighting specific sequences. See here? This reminds me of how simple Earth organisms respond to environmental changes. And this sequence, it's similar to how neural networks adapt and grow. The precursors weren't just studying consciousness, they were studying how it emerges and develops. Kvex's crystalline appendages sparkled with interest. Most intriguing. The dominant species in our galaxy achieved consciousness through different paths: quantum evolution, hive mind emergence, crystalline fusion. We've always assumed these were separate developments. But what if they're all expressions of the same underlying principles? Samira's excitement grew. The patterns I'm seeing suggest consciousness follows universal rules, just like physics or mathematics. The precursors might have understood these rules. Their discussion was interrupted by a commotion near the sphere. A team of Proximan researchers had begun setting up complex scanning equipment, their movements quick and purposeful. What's happening? Samira asked, though she already suspected the answer. Politics, Kvex said grimly. Your success has made many uncomfortable. The Proximan Science Council is particularly invested in maintaining their position as the galaxy's leading experts in consciousness studies. Samira watched as the researchers surrounded her workspace with their equipment. They're trying to shut me out. They will try, Kvex agreed. But remember, you saw patterns that eluded our finest minds. Trust your insights, even when others doubt them. Over the next few days, Samira found her access to the sphere increasingly restricted. The Proximan team ran constant scans, claiming they needed uninterrupted data collection. When she did get time with the artifact, there was always someone watching, documenting her every move. But they couldn't stop her from thinking, from letting her mind work on the puzzle even when she wasn't directly studying it. During her brief sessions with the sphere, she noticed something odd: the new symbols seemed to respond differently depending on who was present. Late one night, unable to sleep, Samira was reviewing her notes when she noticed a pattern she'd missed. The sphere's symbols didn't just represent consciousness, they seemed to be conscious in some way themselves. Their movements weren't random or even purely mathematical, they were reactive, adaptive. She rushed to her terminal and sent a message to Kvex. Minutes later, they met in an unused observation dome, the stars of the galactic core wheeling overhead. Look at these response patterns, Samira explained, displaying her analysis. The sphere isn't just a puzzle or a database. It's trying to communicate, but it needs observers who can recognize and respond to its patterns. That's why the Proximan scans aren't showing anything meaningful, they're treating it like a passive object. Kvex studied the data, their crystalline form glowing with increasing intensity. If you're right, this changes everything. The precursors didn't leave us a test or a library, they left us a teacher. A teacher that can only reach students who are ready to learn, Samira added. But how do we prove it? Carefully, Kvex warned. You've already challenged many deeply held beliefs. This revelation will face even stronger resistance. Samira looked up at the stars, thinking of Earth and how far humanity had come. They can resist all they want. The patterns are there, waiting to be understood. We just have to be brave enough to see them. The Galactic Institute's emergency council session had been running for 6 hours when they finally called Samira in. The chamber was arranged in concentric rings rising toward the ceiling, filled with representatives from every major spacefaring species. The precursor sphere floated in the center, its symbols moving in languid patterns that seemed almost mournful. Dr. Patel, Director Enigmatic began, their crystalline form radiating cautionary colors. The Proximan research team reports that the sphere's behavioral patterns have become increasingly erratic since your last interaction with it. They believe your unorthodox methods may have damaged the artifact. Samira had expected this, but the accusation still stung. The sphere isn't damaged, she stated firmly. It's responding to being treated like an inanimate object. Our research suggests it's a semi-conscious entity. Preposterous. The interruption came from Dr. R.H. Tal. The human is anthropomorphizing a mathematical construct. This is precisely why primitive species shouldn't have access to advanced artifacts. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Samira noticed that Kvex's usual seat was empty. Her mentor had been mysteriously called away on urgent business, just as the political pressure was mounting. If I may, Samira said, fighting to keep her voice steady, I can demonstrate the sphere's responsive nature. It's not just responding to me. It's capable of engaging with any consciousness that approaches it with the right framework of understanding. You propose another demonstration? Enigmatic asked. After your last attempt led to these disturbing changes? The changes aren't disturbing, they're progress. The sphere is like a seed germinating. It's not breaking down, it's growing. The chamber erupted in overlapping arguments. Some scholars supported further investigation, while others demanded the artifact be sealed away for preservation. Through it all, the sphere's patterns shifted and swirled, and Samira noticed something none of the others seemed to see. It was responding to their emotional energy, reflecting the chaos of their debate in its symbolic movements. Enough, Enigmatic declared finally. We will permit one final demonstration. If you cannot prove your theories conclusively, Dr. Patel, all human access to the artifact will be permanently revoked. Samira approached the sphere, hyper-aware of the hundreds of eyes watching her. She had spent weeks studying the patterns, comparing them to everything from Earth's weather systems to neural network evolution. The sphere wasn't just showing patterns, it was teaching a universal language of consciousness itself. The precursors weren't trying to test our mathematical ability, she began, reaching out to touch the sphere's surface. They were looking for species that could understand consciousness as a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. The sphere responded to her touch, its symbols brightening and beginning to move in more complex patterns. Several scholars leaned forward, their skepticism warring with curiosity. Each of our species developed consciousness differently, Samira continued. But underneath those differences are universal principles. The sphere doesn't just demonstrate these principles, it embodies them. She activated her tablet, projecting her research data around the sphere. Look at these response patterns. They mirror the way consciousness emerges in everything from single-celled organisms to quantum neural networks. The sphere isn't a puzzle to be solved, it's a bridge between different forms of consciousness. The symbols began moving faster, forming intricate three-dimensional structures that filled the chamber. Some scholars gasped as they recognized patterns similar to their own species' cognitive development. It's beautiful, someone whispered. But how can we be sure it's not simply reflecting our own expectations? Because of this, Samira said, inputting a new sequence. The sphere's patterns suddenly shifted, displaying completely novel configurations. These are patterns we've never seen before, possibilities for consciousness that no known species has developed. The sphere isn't just showing us what is, it's showing us what could be. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The precursors hadn't left behind just a record of their knowledge, they had created a tool to help future species explore the full potential of consciousness itself. But before Samira could continue her explanation, alarms began blaring throughout the institute. The sphere's symbols were moving faster than ever, pulses of energy radiating from its surface. "Shut it down!" Tal shouted. "The human has destabilized it." "No!" Samira protested. "It's not destabilizing, it's reaching out. Can't you see? The patterns are trying to sync with our own consciousness." The chamber descended into chaos as scholars argued about whether to intervene. Energy continued pulsing from the sphere, its patterns growing increasingly complex. Samira stood her ground, watching in awe as the symbols began forming structures she had only theorized about in her most ambitious research. "Dr. Patel," Anaxilitha's voice cut through the noise. "What exactly is happening?" Samira smiled, understanding flooding through her as she watched the patterns unfold. "It's not just teaching us anymore," she said. "It's ready to show us something new. Something the precursors wanted us to discover only when we were ready to understand it." The sphere's light filled the chamber, and in its patterns, Samira saw the beginning of a revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about consciousness, intelligence, and humanity's place in the cosmos. The sphere's radiance filled the council chamber with shifting patterns of light that seemed to pierce directly into the consciousness of every being present. Samira stood transfixed as the symbols coalesced into structures of impossible complexity, each pattern building upon the last in an accelerating cascade of information. "Everyone, remain calm," Director Anaxilith ordered, though their crystalline form vibrated with barely contained excitement or fear, perhaps both. "Dr. Patel, are you still in control of this situation?" Before Samira could respond, the sphere's patterns suddenly locked into a new configuration. The chaotic swirl of symbols resolved into a coherent three-dimensional matrix that hung in the air like a constellation of living mathematics. Within the pattern, Samira recognized elements of every known form of consciousness, from the simple binary patterns of primitive AI to the quantum complexity of the most advanced alien minds. "It's a map," she breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "Not of space or time, but of consciousness itself." The chamber erupted in exclamations as scholars from dozens of species recognized aspects of their own cognitive patterns within the display. But there was more, gaps in the matrix, spaces waiting to be filled with forms of consciousness that had not yet evolved or been discovered. "Impossible," Dr. Tal declared, but his feathered crest was fully extended in a display of intense interest. "The computational power required to model consciousness at this scale goes beyond anything we've achieved," Samira finished. "But the precursors managed it. And they left this for us to find when we were ready." A sharp crack echoed through the chamber as one of the crystalline scholars spontaneously split into two, their species' expression of extreme emotional or intellectual stimulation. Others were recording frantically, their various sensory organs straining to capture every detail of the unfolding phenomenon. The sphere pulsed again, and new patterns began emerging within the matrix. Samira watched in amazement as they took shape, forming what looked like pathways or evolutionary trajectories. "It's not just showing us what consciousness is," she explained, her hands moving through the holographic display as she traced the patterns. "It's showing us how it evolves and grows. Look, these pathways show how different forms of consciousness can develop and intersect." "And what is the purpose of this map?" Anaxilith asked, their tone cautious but curious. "Understanding," came a familiar voice. Kvex had returned, moving slowly into the chamber. The precursors weren't just cataloging consciousness, they were trying to understand its fundamental nature. And they wanted to share that understanding with species mature enough to grasp its implications. The sphere's patterns shifted again, and Samira gasped as she recognized something in the new configuration. These pathways, they're not just showing past and present forms of consciousness. They're showing potential futures. "Look here," she pointed to a particularly complex intersection of patterns. "This shows how different types of consciousness could theoretically combine and evolve together." "Combine?" R.H. Tal's voice was sharp with surprise. You mean, merge? More like collaborate, Samira corrected. The pattern suggests that consciousness isn't meant to develop in isolation. The most complex and advanced forms emerge from the interaction between different types of awareness. The implications hit the chamber like a shock wave. For millennia, most spacefaring species had developed their technologies and consciousness in relative isolation, viewing their path as unique and often superior. The sphere was suggesting a completely different approach. This is why a human could understand it, Kvek said softly. Your species is young enough to still see connections that others have forgotten to look for. The sphere's light pulsed again, stronger this time, and new symbols began appearing around its surface. These were different from the others, more urgent, more directed. It's trying to show us something else, Samira said, stepping closer. The symbols seemed to reach out to her, forming patterns that resonated with her own thoughts. I think it wants to demonstrate what it's been trying to teach us. Dr. Patel, Enexilith warned, perhaps we should take time to analyze what we've already learned before. But it was too late. The sphere's patterns had already begun to synchronize with the neural patterns of everyone in the chamber. Samira felt a strange sensation, as if her consciousness was expanding beyond the boundaries of her own mind. Around her, other scholars were experiencing similar effects. The hive-mind mathematicians were humming in harmonic resonance, their collective consciousness rippling with new possibilities. The quantum beings shimmered with unprecedented pattern formations. Even the crystalline scholars were refracting light in ways that had never been observed before. It's not just teaching us about consciousness, Samira realized, her voice filled with awe. It's showing us how to transcend our current limitations. The precursors didn't just leave us a map, they left us a key to the next stage of cognitive evolution. The chamber filled with a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In that moment, as consciousness touched consciousness across the boundaries of species and evolution, the true message of the precursors began to unfold, a message that would forever change the way the galaxy's inhabitants understood themselves and each other. In the days that followed the sphere's revelation, the Galactic Institute underwent a transformation unlike anything in its long history. The Great Hall had been converted into a permanent research center, with scholars from hundreds of species working together in unprecedented collaboration. The sphere floated at the center, its patterns now a constant dance of interactive consciousness that responded to every mind that approached it. Samira stood at her workstation, surrounded by holographic displays showing the ongoing changes in both the sphere and its observers. Next to her, a Proximan quantum specialist and a crystalline consciousness expert worked in perfect synchronization, their previously competing theories now merging into something entirely new. The patterns are still evolving, she noted, watching as new configurations emerged within the sphere's matrix. Every time different species work together, it shows us new possibilities. Indeed, Kvex agreed, their ancient form somehow looking rejuvenated. We've documented over 300 previously unknown consciousness configurations in just the past week. The implications for artificial intelligence alone are revolutionary. The sphere pulsed gently, acknowledging their discussion with a ripple of responsive patterns. What had once seemed like an impenetrable puzzle was now revealed as a living library of consciousness itself, one that grew and evolved along with its students. Director Enexilith drifted over, their crystalline structure now permanently modified by their interaction with the sphere. The Galactic Council has reviewed our latest findings, they announced. They've approved the establishment of a permanent consciousness integration center here at the Institute. Dr. Patel, they request that you lead it. Samira looked up in surprise. Me? But surely there are more experienced. More experienced in traditional methods, perhaps, Enexilith interrupted. But you showed us that experience can become a limitation when it hardens into certainty. Your human perspective helped us see what we had overlooked for millennia. The ability to recognize patterns across different scales of existence, Dr. R.H. Tal added, joining them. His earlier hostility had been replaced by genuine respect. We had become so focused on our individual paths to consciousness that we forgot to look for the connections between them. The sphere brightened in response to their conversation, projecting a new series of patterns that showed the potential links between different species' cognitive architectures. It was no longer just a teaching tool, it had become a bridge between minds, showing how different forms of consciousness could complement and enhance each other. The precursors weren't just advancing their own understanding, Samira realized, watching the patterns unfold. They were preparing the galaxy for a leap forward in evolution. They knew that true advancement could only come through the integration of different perspectives. A truth that humanity seemed uniquely prepared to grasp, Kvex observed. Perhaps because your species still remembers its own journey to consciousness, the steps that others have forgotten. Around them, the research continued. Hive-mind mathematicians worked alongside quantum processors, while organic and artificial intelligences collaborated on new theoretical frameworks. The old hierarchies of species and development were dissolving, replaced by a recognition that every form of consciousness had something valuable to contribute. We're receiving reports from other sectors, Enexilith announced. The effects of our discovery are spreading. Species that have been in conflict for generations are finding new ways to communicate. The sphere's patterns are being used to develop translation matrices that work not just with language, but with thought itself. Samira watched as a group of young scholars, representing species that had once been bitter rivals, worked together at a nearby station. They were using the sphere's teachings to develop a new form of computational architecture that combined organic, quantum, and crystalline processing. The precursors didn't leave us this gift to show us how far we had to go, she said softly. They left it to show us how far we could go together. The sphere's light pulsed in agreement, its patterns forming a brief image that took Samira's breath away, a vision of consciousness evolving not as separate streams, but as a vast, interconnected network of minds working in harmony. The real test is just beginning, Kvex reminded them. Using this knowledge wisely will require as much wisdom as it did to discover it. Samira nodded, thinking of Earth and how this discovery would change humanity's place in the galactic community. They were no longer seen as primitive newcomers but as valuable contributors with a fresh perspective on the universe's greatest mysteries. The sphere shows us possibilities, she said, but it's up to us to make them real. Every species, every form of consciousness, has a role to play in what comes next. As if in response to her words, the sphere's patterns shifted one final time, forming a symbol that everyone present, regardless of their origin or nature, understood instantly. It wasn't just a message or a mathematical proof, it was a promise of what consciousness could become when diversity was seen not as a barrier but as a source of strength. The future that the precursors had envisioned was finally beginning, and it would be shaped not by any single species or form of intelligence, but by all of them working together in ways that had once seemed impossible. In the end, the greatest puzzle hadn't been the sphere itself, but the challenge of learning to see through each other's eyes.